It's time to get inside the Giants Huddle.
Let's go.
On Giants.com.
I like it.
And the Giants mobile app.
Boom, give me some juice.
Part of the Giants Podcast Network.
Let's roll.
Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. I am John Schmeelk, joined by Matt Citak. We are reacting to Hard Knocks Episode 4, which aired last night on HBO. A great watch, Matt, and it's funny. We know what happens here. Yet as Joe Schoen's on the phone talking to guys and sitting there with ownership and seeing how everything's going to go down, I am literally like my legs bobbing up and down and I'm shaking and I'm tense just trying to put myself in Joe Schoen's shoes on draft day, trying to finalize exactly what the team is going to do.
Yeah, I mean, we know now a couple months later, as you said, exactly what happened, but I guess we didn't really know how many different possibilities there were of what could have gone down that first night of the draft. I mean, we've seen the reports, obviously, going back to day one about Giants' potential interest in, moving up, moving down, sticking pat. But it wasn't until we saw this episode last night that we really got an inside look at exactly how those conversations went down, who we had those conversations with. I mean, the Giants, going into the draft day, had plans to potentially move up, plans to stay at 6, and plans to move down. And it was just really cool to see Joe kind of juggling all of these balls at once, preparing for, whatever could happen in the first 5 picks of the draft.
And I'm not sure how much it was edited together to make it all seem like it was happening on the last day, but the fact that a lot of that stuff, like day of the draft, and they're still finalizing, it tells you that, I think they had their plan, their strategy in place, but they were getting the particulars in place the final day. How much you really use every second leading up to draft night to make sure you have all your ducks in a row.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that scene with, Joe and his family, and he kind of kicked them out at, what was it, like 1:20? A solid 6.5 hours before
guys,
the
it's
draft.
1:20. You got to go. That's pretty much what it was.
He was not wasting any time. He was getting all of his ducks in a row, preparing for every possible scenario, which is what you want to see your GM doing.
Absolutely. All right, so let's start with where the episode started, the quarterback situation. We'll go through that, then we'll kind of go through everything else you saw in the episode. Because it started with Joe Schoen having a conversation with Chris Mara. The way I kind of took it is that it seemed like he was describing to Chris how he was going to talk to Daniel about the draft and the quarterback situation. And basically he said, and this is how you can have two things being true at the same time and how there is nuance to the world of football and the NFL and the Giants, where, look, they think Daniel Jones can be a good NFL quarterback. They believe in Daniel. They paid him the money for a reason. But at the same time, he's had a lot of injuries going back to 2021. And you have to protect yourself. And at the same time, if you have a chance to go up there and grab a quarterback you think can be a superstar, and you have, conviction on that player, you don't want to pick in the top 6 very often. You want to, as Brandon Brown said, I thought he made a great point, maximize your value when you're picking that high in the draft. That's what you're trying to do. So if you can go and you can get that guy that you believe in, great, because of Daniel's injury history. It doesn't mean you think he's a bad quarterback. It doesn't mean you don't think he can succeed. But that's how the Giants were approaching this draft process at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I mean, we hear all the time for years, both players, front office, coaches, they talk all the time. This is a business. And Joe Schoen has to do what's best for the interests of the New York Giants. And so we see the negotiations later in the episode that Joe had trying to move up potentially for a quarterback. And the thing that stuck out with me just in that beginning scene with Joe talking to Chris Mara is that he straight up says that, like, one of the biggest things for him is wanting to have open communication with Daniel Jones. He does not want Daniel Jones to be, shocked, surprised that the Giants pull off a trade the night of the draft and moving up to take.
Why is Drake May in the cafeteria today?
And, that might seem like, a somewhat minor thing, but I feel like every year we see some veteran quarterback in the league get upset because his team went and drafted a quarterback without any sort of heads up. I mean, the Atlanta Falcons signed Kirk Cousins to this big deal in free agency and then surprised everyone, including Kirk Cousins, by taking Michael Penix at number 8. So it was very clear that Joe did not want any sort of situation like that to happen. He was going to be open and honest with Daniel about any possible trade. And that's exactly what we saw in that conversation that Joe had with Chris Mara.
Yeah, and then they went about the process of evaluating these quarterbacks and figuring out which guys they would be willing to move up for. Because as they evaluated the position, they figured out pretty early on that if they want to go get either Caleb Williams, who got mentioned briefly, but then everyone knew the Bears were taking him, so you can just push him aside.
Yep.
Then, of course, you have Drake May, who they didn't know about, and Jaden Daniels, who they didn't know about. Eventually, they figured out Washington was going to pick Daniels at 2, and they were not going to make a trade with the team in the division. And they were evaluating all these players. They brought them in. They went to all the pro days. They had conversations. I thought the conversation that Dable had with Jaden Daniels was very interesting. The first thing he asked him, well, would you want to be here? Like, no, not, of course I want to play for that. I would play for any team. Like, do you really want to be the quarterback for the Giants? And he was, yes, of course I do. And just the conversations, you get them in a room, you saw them practicing the cadence and everything, and the quarterbacks talking about how you adjust at the line of scrimmage to stuff. And I just thought they really went in depth on all these guys to figure out who would fit. And they eventually figured out if they wanted to get one of these guys that they really focus on, and the two quarterbacks they seem to really focus on were in this episode were Drake May and Jaden Daniels, you were going to have to move up to 3 to get him. And eventually what it came down to, which is what we talked about on Big Blue Kickoff Live during the draft process, why neither one of us believed New England would ever move. You didn't even get the idea that if the Giants came with the Godfather offer that the Patriots were going to move the pick.
No.
They basically said, look, we're in a situation where we need a quarterback. We're going to pick the quarterback. And frankly, if I'm the Patriots, that's what I would have done too. If I'm Washington, that's what I would have done too, as we talked about on our other shows leading up to the draft. So as much as the Giants were willing to move up, and they were not going to be willing to give a Godfather offer, they were going to willing to give. They kept saying it was going to start with next year's 1, and then what is it plus that, right?
Yep.
And they were willing to make a deal like that because they have conviction on the player, but that trade really never was realistic.
No, it wasn't. I mean, as every football fan knows, the quarterback position is the most important position on the field.
In all sports, maybe.
Yeah, probably in all sports. It's the guy that touches the ball every single play. There, you don't really have a situation like that in any other sport, really, and especially not in football. But yeah, in that conversation that Joe had with Elliott Wolf at the Patriots, Elliott Wolf literally says at one point, if we had a quarterback already, this would be a very different conversation. We would be calling in the trade to the league right now if we already had our quarterback situation set. But we don't, and so he made it very clear, doesn't really matter what you offer. There's not really much of a chance that we're going to, move away from this trade. Joe even brought up, he said, is this going to have to be like a Ricky Williams type trade package, which is one of like the biggest trade packages any team has ever given up to move up. That was for the number 1 pick in the draft, I believe Ricky Williams went.
Yeah, second overall, I think. Yeah, I think the quarterback went first overall.
But that really was what you would consider a Godfather offer. They gave up a lot for that trade, and it's clear that, even that sort of offer probably wasn't going to move the needle for the Patriots. They were pretty set. I mean, where they are in their rebuild, they're at the very beginning. They have a new coach, just moved on from Bill Belichick in that long era of success in the Patriots franchise, and they're starting over. And what better way to do that than with a young rookie quarterback that you have conviction about, which it was very clear that they felt that way about Drake May, because you didn't get any sense that they would be willing to, potentially move down to 6 to look at that next tier of quarterbacks, the J.J. McCarthy, Michael Penix, Bo Nix. It was pretty clear that they had no interest in those guys, which shows that they were ready to start their rebuild with Drake May. And so, going back to draft day.
Ricky Williams was the 5th pick, by the way.
Oh, 5th.
I did not remember that at all. It was Tim
Wow.
Couch. I was right about that. Donovan McNabb, Achilles Smith, I remember Adrian James did get picked at Ricky Williams in that draft, and then Ricky Williams was 5th. Sorry.
Wow. That's a lot to move up to number 5.
Yes, detour.
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New you moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
But just going back to our vantage point of draft night, there was all this buzz leading up to the very start of the first round that the Giants were aggressively trying to move up with New England for Drake May. And after watching this episode, it's pretty clear about 6 hours before the draft started, Joe Schoen knew that was not an option, that moving up to 3 was not going to happen, which means they were going to miss out on those top 3 quarterbacks, and that pretty much took quarterback out of the equation for the Giants.
Yeah, and I think they said if you can't get a quarterback, you want to give Daniel the best weapon you can to help him along. A couple other things about the trade situation that I thought was interesting. First, I thought the comparisons to the Eli Manning trade 20 years ago and just getting John Mara's take on that, where he goes, look, what was the phrase he used talking about potentially trading up for quarterback? He didn't say heartburn, but it was something like that.
Heart palpitations.
Palpitations, thank you. Heart palpitations. And he said, it was the same way I felt 20 years ago for the Eli Manning trade, talking about whether or not you would make this trade this year. But he said, look, much like with Ernie Accorsi 20 years ago, if you guys have the conviction on a quarterback, go make the trade. But trading all that draft capital away that should give you heart palpitations. It'll give me heart palpitations too, because if you're going all in on one player and that player is going to make or break your organization, and it's not just you're picking him where you're picking, right? You're using multiple assets to put together to pick that guy. I would have heart palpitations, but I think the biggest takeaway is that, look, if you guys believe in him, I trust you as football evaluators to go make that trade. Go make that trade if you want to make it. I'll back you. But just how it's so similar and how getting to that conclusion is really tough. But we saw how they went back and forth in the draft room, talking to Brian Dable, talking to all the scouts in the room and the coaches and stuff like that, getting their takes in terms of what quarterbacks would you be willing to move up for. And from based on what we saw in the episode, it would be Jaden Daniels or Drake May, right?
Yep.
And just how tough of a decision it is. Joe Schoen even said, look, this has been occupying my mind, and it's been the thing that's been in me for the past 2 weeks. I just want Elliot Wolf to tell me, is this even realistic? Because I'm tired of thinking about it. That's how big a move like that is. And I think films, and the reason I got kind of so tense watching it, I thought they really conveyed the gravity of a move like that and how tough it is to come to that decision to move all those picks for one player, the way the Giants did for Eli Manning back in the day. I had never seen that throwaway Ben Roethlisberger line, by the way, where he's sitting there wow, they gave him a lot to move up for him, didn't they? And Roethlisberger was their second choice that year, by the way. If they couldn't move for Eli, they were going to take Roethlisberger. That's been kind of talked about a lot. But I just thought they did a really good job of showing how ownership, everyone involved, these are the guys we're willing to target, go get it done. But, even just going through, and Brian Dable going through all the quarterbacks the last 10 years, right? Fail. And they had the guys in blue that were all on the same team and red that weren't. And it was, I didn't count them, but I think it was 50-50, maybe even a little worse than that in terms of guys that are hit. Joe Schoen did point out that I thought was telling, look, if you're picking the top 3, your hit rate does go up. And if you do look at it, absolutely true. Top 3 quarterbacks versus non-top 3 quarterbacks in the first round, very different results, generally speaking. So I just thought they really showed the gravity of a move if you're going to go up there and get a quarterback, and how much it means to the organization, how much the Giants understood what a big move that would have been.
Yeah, I mean, I thought one of the most interesting parts of the whole episode was, you just mentioned it, when John Mara walked into Brandon Brown's office, and Brandon Brown looks at Mr. Mara and literally says, what was it 20 years ago that gave ownership the confidence in letting Ernie Accorsi make that trade for Eli Manning? And John Mara said, Ernie had conviction. He knew that was the quarterback that was going to change the fortune for this franchise.
And there were 2 things. He said he did well in college without a good supporting cast around him, which, by the way, immediately made me think of Drake May. It immediately made me think of Drake May. The second part, versus Roethlisberger, and then he said, what was the difference between Eli and Roethlisberger, right? He said Roethlisberger was the smaller conference. What was that?
Miami of Ohio.
I'm not sure what conference they were in then. But Eli played in the SEC, right? Yep. And then my mind automatically said Jaden Daniels, right? So you kind of saw how that played into the evaluation of the current class.
Yeah, for sure. And, I also, this clip we've seen before, but right after that conversation, they showed an old interview. I think it's an old interview of Ernie Accorsi.
I think it was old. I was trying to figure that out too.
Talking about this, the same situation, the trade, and Ernie Accorsi literally said, either I was going to get it right and it was going to be great, or I was going to get it wrong and then I'd be out of here anyway.
And Brandon Beane has said that before publicly, and that's who Joe Schoen worked under in Buffalo.
Yeah, I mean, when you kind of go all in on a quarterback, it kind of decides somewhat your fate as the GM. If you're moving up to trade, if you're trading up and giving up a lot of your future draft picks for a quarterback, you better be right. It's tough.
Better be right.
It's tough for a GM to overcome a big miss like that. I mean, in recent memory, the 49ers is one situation where that was not the case. And the only reason I believe when they moved up for Trey Lance, they gave up a lot to move up for Trey Lance.
And the Jets' current regime picked Zach Wilson, correct?
They did, yes.
That would be the other one, I think, right?
I believe. Well, did they move up for Zach Wilson?
Yeah, they did.
I don't even remember.
I don't remember what they traded for him, but yeah, I think they did. I'll have to double check that.
Well.
But yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. No, but your point you were making, that's my bad. You're right. It's hard to survive if they take a swing.
So it's like the only situation that comes to the top of mind that a GM survived making such a, I guess colossally bad trade was the 49ers with Lynch, and that's only because they got lucky and Brock Purdy, the Mr. Irrelevant of that draft, ended up being their franchise quarterback. And obviously, you look through the history of the NFL draft, hitting on this last pick in the NFL draft, a 7th-round pick, a day 3 pick at the quarterback position, having that guy turn into your franchise quarterback, that does not happen. It just does not happen very often. You can think of, a handful of situations in the last 30 years of that happening. Tom Brady, I guess Dak Prescott was an early day 3 pick. Russell Wilson was round 3, I think. So not even
Kirk
a day
Cousins
3
was
pick.
round 3.
Yeah, so it's
round 2.
It's really tough to overcome making a decision like that and having it backfire on you. So I did think it was, kind of telling of Mr. Mara to say, if you have conviction about a quarterback, I support you. I'm all in.
And you need to hear that from ownership too, by the way.
Yes,
do. It's important
of
to hear
course. And the only other thing that kind of stood out to me about all these trade negotiations for a quarterback was during that conversation between Joe Shane and Elliott Wolf, after Elliott Wolf tells Joe, it looks like we're sticking. We need to get our quarterback. And he says to Joe, you really have had great communication with me over these last however many weeks it's been. Like, if anything, I've been the one that's been bad communicating, but like, I basically said, like, I really commend you for how you've done communicating with us about your interests, potential trade packages. And that's always just great to see. I mean, you want a GM that's going to be able to negotiate with other GMs around the league and do it well, and not be a guy that's like, hounding an opposing GM or, getting under his skin in some way. Like, Elliott Wolf literally said, like, I'm sorry we're not doing this trade. We need to get our quarterback, but like, thank you for, being so great at these negotiations the last few weeks.
Sorry for being distracted. Dan Orlovsky's on Pat McAfee. He looks like he just came off of a bender. He looks like he's in rough shape right now. He's in a tank. It's very funny. Anyway, sorry. Football season is coming, and so is the next college semester. If you need funding, a Citizen student loan could help you pay for 100% of your school certified costs. Get your rate quote in about 2 minutes at citizensbank.com/pay-for-college. One other thing about the trade back, and we'll get into the trade discussions. We'll finish the trade discussion, then we'll get into the wide receivers, right? They kind of set it up on draft day, okay, well, if we can't move up and we're sticking here, well, then how will we move back? And I thought the one telling thing, at least related to the quarterback question, is that you didn't really hear them mention as an option for them either J.J. McCarthy or Michael Penix.
No.
So for the Giants, even trading down into that 9-10 area, and they didn't seem to be interested in moving much further than that. Though, in the teaser for next week, there seemed to be an indication the Jets were calling to maybe move down to 11, so maybe this will change next week. But we never really heard any quarterbacks besides May or
the Jets were at
Daniels
10.
mentioned.
They ended up moving down
You're
to
right.
11.
They were at 10. I'm sorry, you're right. So that seems to be kind of where they were, but I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, the only time we saw or heard really J.J. McCarthy was when he was in the building for his visit.
Yeah.
Meeting with, all the offensive staff, which, just going back to that for a second, that scene was so cool. Just with the different quarterbacks in that room with, Brian Dable, Mike Kafka, Shea Tierney, like all the offensive coaches that would have would get their hands on the prospect, having all of them be in that room and watching the quarterbacks go through, as you mentioned before, all the cadences and, all that stuff. That was just so cool to see. That's the sort of stuff you never get to see. We never see those prospect visits, what actually goes down, the conversations, in the meeting rooms, what happens. And that I just thought that was such a cool scene.
Yeah, I thought it was too. And by the way, Joe Douglas did draft Zach Wilson, but then I didn't have to look it up. I remember this. Remember they won like their last game of the year, so they didn't pick a first overall, and they lost that on Trevor Lawrence. So they did not have to trade up for Wilson. He was just their pick at second overall. So with the quarterback game a failure, not being able to move up and get a quarterback, very happy to move forward with Daniel and then get a weapon for him. And it was the same guys we talked about throughout the draft process. Not a surprise. They really did seem to have Malik Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. on the top of their board. There was a little bit of a separation between those two guys, and then Odunze and Brock Bowers, who seemed to be, we talk about trading down. Those are the two guys they would try to get if they would trade down. But they seem to have Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. as their top two guys in terms of the non-quarterbacks they would want to target at number 6.
Yeah, and maybe this was just how they ended up cutting the show, because obviously we know that the Giants ended up taking Malik Neighbors, but in tonight's episode, they showed, like, going back to Malik's pro day, just how high, especially Brian Dable was.
Loves Malik
Dable,
Neighbors.
I mean, it was clear in, I think it was episode 2 when they met at the Combine, that Brian Dable fell in love with Malik Neighbors. But if you weren't convinced, last night's episode clearly showed it. They're standing at the sideline at LSU pro day, and Brian Dable turns to Joe Shane and says to him about Malik Neighbors, that guy's a stud on tape. He's got a little dog in him. And then, a little later in the episode, Joe Shane's describing what it means to have, like, that dog in you. But it was very clear from the start that Malik Neighbors was at very near the top, if not towards the top, of the Giants draft board. They loved him.
Yeah, and they never said whether or not the organization had Neighbors or Harrison ahead of each other. They asked Mike Groh, the wide receiver coach. He said he liked Neighbors.
Between the 3 receivers, he chose
Neighbors
Neighbors
as number 1. We don't know how the organization had Harrison. If both guys were there, I don't think we know for sure which guy they would have picked based on what was said in the episode. But if frankly, it could have been Neighbors. It would not shock me if it was.
Yeah, it would not have shocked me either. I mean, Joe made it very clear, later in the episode, once the Patriots trade was off the table, going into the draft, Joe directly said, if we're at 6 and Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors is on the board, we're not moving. We're staying pat. We're running up to the podium and picking one of those 2 guys. And, as you mentioned earlier in the episode, they said, if we can't get a quarterback, we'll shift towards getting Daniel the best playmaker possible. And it's exactly what they did.
It was, and that's exactly how it worked out. And then, if both those guys were gone, and I thought it was interesting, it was the same conversations we were having here on our shows, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're pretty sure the Cardinals are going to take Harrison. And if not Harrison, they'll take Neighbors. They'll pick a wide receiver. And they thought the Chargers were going to pick an offensive lineman, but even when Joe Shane brought in, Mr. Tish and Mr. Mara, the 2 owners, into that meeting draft day to explain what was going on here, they're like, look, but they do, and John Mara goes, but they need a wide receiver, though. He goes, yeah, it's possible. And that's when they talked about the scenarios. All right, well, if Harrison and Neighbors are both gone, who it appeared that they had a bit of a tier above the Rome Odunze and Brock Bowers, where can we move down, right? Bears at 9 is one possible trade that they mentioned, right? They would get a 3 and a 4 for that to move down to 9, and
give up the 5th round pick.
And you would give up the 5th round pick. Frankly, to me, I don't. That's fair value. It's not overwhelming value. So, and they said they would only make that trade if the Bears are moving up to pick an offensive tackle, not if they were moving up to pick a wide receiver.
Yeah,
they made that abundantly clear.
Because they were confident if that situation they moved down to 9, that they would still have a very good chance at taking Rome Odunze, him still being there, and if not, Brock Bowers.
Right.
So they would still come out of the draft with an elite playmaker, an elite pass catcher for Daniel Jones, while picking up an extra 3rd and 4th round pick.
The risk there was that the Falcons, they assumed were going to pick Dallas Turner.
Yes.
Then they had to pick
or an edge rusher, at least.
They ended up picking Michael Penix, which no one expected.
Nobody
but they
saw
assumed
that coming.
They were not going to pick a tight end or a wide receiver. But there was a risk there. And they also said, look, everyone thinks that the Titans are picking an offensive lineman. Well, what if Tennessee didn't? You know what I mean? So you're still dealing with a lot of risk in that potential trade down to 9 that they talked about.
Yeah, I mean, there was buzz going into the draft that Rome Odunze could be in play for Tennessee at 7.
Yep.
So that definitely would have been a risky move to move down to 9. I think if that had happened, and even if Odunze had gone 7, I do think the Giants would have come out of the draft with Brock Bowers then. I don't think someone would have then moved up to take Brock Bowers away from the Giants. So they still would have come out with a playmaker. But just sticking on Rome for a second, another thing that stood out to me was when Rome was in Joe's office with Joe and Dabes, and they asked him, do you have any questions for us? And Rome Odunze said, yeah, what sort of type of person, not the football part, but off the field, what type of person are you looking to bring in? And Dabes pretty much told him straight up, you are the exact type of character that we want in this locker room. I mean, I think the quote was, we're looking for good people that are also good players, and you fit that to a T.
Which is not surprising based on what we heard about Odunze leading. I thought it was interesting, though, that was the question Odunze chose to ask them. It wasn't about the quarterback, the offense. He wanted to know about the locker room, what it would be like to play here. I thought that was interesting.
I have a feeling he kind of knew that they would answer something like that. I mean, he clearly knows, Rome Odunze, that he's a high-character guy, a leader at Washington. I think, just my 2 cents, but I think he kind of had a sense that they would come back with some sort of response being like, yeah, you're the type of personality that we look for in this locker room.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
We mentioned the potential trade down. They also said they would talk to the Titans at 7 in terms of maybe sliding down one spot. The Titans wanted to move up and draft somebody. But again, you could see Joe Schoen basically going down the list. All right, well, we have potential trades in place at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He never mentioned 8 with the Falcons. So it sounded like the Falcons were locked in on Penix at that point, and nobody knew that's who they were locked in on.
Which
but
is crazy.
They were not going to move, and they were just going to pick their guy and stick there. And then he said down to 9, and then again, like I said in the teaser, we'll see what happens when the Jets call about the 10th overall pick. But, he kind of had all that stuff lined up just in case they had to move up and down the board on draft day. And again, so much of it was happening kind of like at the last second. It seemed like the way it was edited, maybe a lot of that, I'm sure a lot of that legwork was done in advance, but in terms of just making sure nothing changes that close to the draft, Joe Schoen was pretty busy once he got his family out of there at 120.
Oh, for sure. But, it seemed like, and again, in my opinion, but it really seemed like of all those, potential trade situations that Joe worked out prior to the start of the draft, the only one that it seemed like he thought had somewhat of a chance of happening was the trade with the Bears.
That's what it seemed like based on how it was edited.
Because, I mean, we saw the conversation with the Patriots where Elliott Wolf told him we're not trading. And then while he did say at one point, we have a trade worked out with the Cardinals at 4, there was another part where I believe it was Joe said Monty, talking about the GM of the Cardinals, seems pretty set at sticking at 4 and probably taking Marvin Harrison. And
understandably so.
I guess the one team that's really a question mark was the Chargers. If the Giants really wanted to trade up from 6 to 5 and told them, look, we're taking a wide receiver here, and the Chargers knew they were taking Joe Alt, maybe that would have been a situation that they would have traded, but we didn't really see any of that. But yeah, the Bears situation, clearly Joe had a plan if Malik and Marvin Harrison were both gone, and it was a plan that Joe, Brian Dable, and Mr. Mara and Mr. Tisch, they all seemed comfortable with. Obviously, Joe made it very clear that they wanted Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors, but it seemed like worst case scenario, those 2 guys are gone. We're good with trading down to 9, picking up those 3rd and 4th round picks, and still getting one of those elite playmakers, Rome Odunze or Brock Bowers.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that was very interesting. And, the other thing with the receivers, I think having all 3 guys in the building on the same day when they had their
so cool.
30 visits, and you had Mike Groh in the room working with all 3 of them, kind of just almost the same way Dable was rapid fire quizzing the quarterbacks at the combine. It was the same way that Mike Groh was quizzing them in that room, boom, 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 and just trying to get, all right, well, you go right the quarterback, what do you tell him? Well, how do you convert to an X in this situation? Just really hardcore X's and O's stuff to seeing how much these guys were into it and got it mentally, and he seemed to be pretty happy with how all 3 guys did.
Yeah, and I think that's actually an interesting tactic. If you know that wide receiver, or a certain position, doesn't even have to be wide receiver, a certain position is going to be one of your top targets, I'm all for bringing in multiple guys at that position that will be in play for you and having them in the room at the same time and in a way sort of compete against each other. Obviously this is off the field, it's in the meeting room, but as Mike Rowe was quizzing them, it was like very interesting to see, which guys got it right, like which guys were quick to give an answer, the correct answer. Like, I'm all for having all the guys compete, bring them in at the same time and have them compete even off the field, because you want to see which guys, even off the field, are like, I guess, the most mentally tough.
Yeah.
And, quick with their decisions, high football IQ, and best way to do it is to compare them with the other guys at the position. The only other thing that I thought, sticking on the, wide receivers, potential trade down situation, that was very, very interesting was the part where Dabes was talking about his conversation with Nick Saban. Obviously, the longtime coach at Alabama, incredibly successful. He asked him, who are your top guys in the draft? Both on either side of the ball. And we only heard about the two offensive guys, but he said there are two offensive players that were just problems for the Alabama defense over the last, couple of seasons. Malik Neighbors and Brock Bowers. And obviously, Nick Saban is potentially one of the most respected coaches in college football history. Brian Dable obviously has a close one with Nick Saban from when he was on the coaching staff there. That definitely held some weight with Brian Dable, with the rest of the Giants. I mean, the Giants have had a long, Alabama connections as an organization. So I think that conversation probably made the Giants feel very comfortable with going into the draft and, about that potential trade down situation. Even if they were to move down to 9, if they walked out with Brock Bowers, I think they still would have been very happy with that.
Sure seemed that way. All right, couple things real quick before you say goodbye. A couple throwaway things I thought were interesting at the Penn State Pro Day.
Oh, yeah.
Let's start with the draft part of the conversation first, where they're talking about Theo Johnson. This was Dennis Hickey, the Giants director of college scouting, was talking to one of the scouts. I forget which one. And he basically says, look, I think this is going to be the second tight end off the board.
Yep.
Given his size, speed, weight, and traits, and he can be a two-way player. So clearly they had their eyes on him early on in the process.
Yeah, he ended up the second tight end drafted. I don't remember what.
I believe it was Ben Sinnott.
Ben Sinnott was too. I don't know what number Theo Johnson
I don't know
offhand
either.
Being, but seemed pretty clear that given that, the Giants were probably very happy with the value they got with taking Theo Johnson in the 4th round.
The other conversation at the Penn State Pro Day was interesting. Oddly, it was Saquon Barkley talking to a new Giants coach that he wasn't here with, not one of the guys that he knew, but he had a conversation with new offensive line coach Carmen Brasillo, and Carmen Brasillo was breaking down what the Giants did in free agency in the offensive line. And just a couple things. He talked about how much he loved Jermaine Illuminor, and then he talked about John Runyon, how he could be right guard, left guard, also center flex in that conversation, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting. And after that conversation, I guess it shed some light maybe on what we saw in the last episode we heard the line like Jermaine Illuminor is our top offensive lineman. It seems pretty clear now that Carmen Brasillo probably had a lot of say in that, because Carmen Brasillo loves Jermaine Illuminor. He literally said, I love him. He is like my child. I haven't heard coaches, especially position coaches, talk about players like that and like on such a personal level, but it is clear that they have a very close relationship, and that my guess would be that played a big part in Jermaine Illuminor wanting to come to New York and the Giants having interest in Jermaine Illuminor in addition to just his abilities on the field, which obviously, he had a great year last year, has been very durable. But that was interesting to see. And the only other thing from that interaction that stood out to me was a comment that Saquon made while they were still talking about the offensive line. And I think it was when Brasillo talked about, wanting to have Runyon next to John Michael Schmitz as like have a steady anchor next to him. Saquon was talking about JMS, and he complimented him about his leadership. JMS was a rookie this past year. He got hurt. It obviously wasn't the best season for the Giants as an offense or the offensive line. But throughout all of that, Saquon said that JMS still stood out to him as a leader and showed leadership qualities. So hearing all of that, it would not surprise me to see whether, I don't know if it'll be this year, but sometime down the road, John Michael Schmitz be a captain of this team.
And it sure didn't seem like there was hard feelings there from Saquon Barkley. He was interested in what the Giants did on the offensive line. Remember, and I just looked it up the date. Penn State Pro Day was March 15th.
So that was right
It was 4 days after he signed with the Eagles. agreed to terms with the Eagles because he was a day one guy. That was March 11th when the negotiating period began. It's the same week, folks.
Yeah.
It's 4 days. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of, screw the Giants. I don't want to talk to anybody from the Giants. Like, that didn't seem to be the case there. You know what I mean?
No.
So just something to keep in mind where I think a lot of people thought about where it was. I think that maybe shed some light on it, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Saquon has said, going back to last year when he got the franchise tag, it's a business.
Business is business.
He knows it's a business. So it didn't seem like, I agree with you, it didn't seem like he was holding, any harsh feelings or ill will towards the Giants in that clip, at least.
Anything else?
No, I think we just about covered everything.
Me too. I
Great
agree.
episode. Can't wait for the finale.
Yeah, can't. I thought they were going to get through the whole draft in this one, but we have actually the actual draft coming our way next week, so there's still a lot of fun stuff to go.
Yeah, I guess the draft, and then I'm assuming we saw a few clips just of spring practices, so I guess they'll show some of that, and maybe you and I will make an appearance on the sideline.
And some 100th anniversary stuff as well. We saw in the little teaser, we had some people from the production staff actually make an appearance. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I saw some I saw some faces in there, and also a member of Paul Dottino's favorite IT department made an appearance too in the episode too, which was good. Football season is coming, and so is the next college semester. If you need funding, a Citizens student loan can help you pay for 100% of your school's certified costs. Get your rate quote in about 2 minutes at citizensbank.com/pay-for-college. We thank you for joining us on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. For Matt Citak, I'm John Schmeelk. We'll see you next time, everybody.